Hey everybody. Hey. What's up? We're gonna get started. I can't memorize anything, so I'm just gonna read all of this off my phone. Welcome to Level-Headed. Is that what it's called? Level-Headed. The final IGD Toronto meeting of the year. Not coming back till January or whenever we feel like it. My name is John Remedios. I put this little night together, and I am a member of the IGD Toronto Steering Committee, along with Leslie Ford-Toy, Brian Henson-Creighton, Emily Claire Fan, Daniel Engels, Alex Hayter, the only other member to show up tonight, Justin Kwok, Randy Ornstein, and Rhett Fester, who films all their stuff. And he showed up. He's rad. Before we start, I just need to do some housekeeping. First, like Mom always said, gotta thank the sponsors. First, our gold sponsor, Ubisoft Toronto. You can clap for that. They gave us money. Next up, the silver sponsors, City of Toronto, who gave us the space tonight, KPMG and George Brown College, and our George Brown College, and our bronze sponsors, Big Viking Games and Massive Damage. So thank you, sponsors. And now some announcements. This is some game announcements. First, we have Lucky Mask Games released Motown on iOS or on the App Store and Google Play Store on November 1st. It's the end of the month, but if you, in the next 2 days, how many days left in the month? If you purchase the game, half the proceeds are donated to their November campaign. Also, this is not really a video game, but it's kind of like one. LockQuest opened up at Summerhill Station. It is its first real-life escape game, Escape the Book Club Killer, is running now. It's $28 a ticket, and you can go there. You can get tickets at lockquest.com. Full disclosure, LockQuest is run by Ryan Creighton, a member of the IGD Toronto chapter, or steering committee. Phantom Compass released Rollers of the Realm on November 18th on PSN Steam. They're here, so everybody should clap. And I believe we're launching in Europe this week. Is that it? Already launched, did it? Wow. Oscar Prusky sent a little thing in. He made a game called Original Game. That's the name of it. For the Indie vs. PewDiePie Jam, it is on a link to it is on our Facebook page. I'm not sure, is that the Facebook page for the event or just the IGA Toronto Facebook page?
Sorry, to change my page.
Okay, just the IGA Toronto page. And an oldie but a goodie, Chivalry Medieval Warfare is coming to Xbox 360 on December 3rd. It was originally released in 2012 for the PC on Steam. Now some upcoming stuff. There's like a pub night thing of delayofgame.ca. They have a thing called Gamers Night Out 2 2014 edition. It's Ferkin on Young. I think it's just drinking beers. I think it's so if you want to drink beers, you can go to Ferkin on Young, 207 Young Street tomorrow night. That should be fun. Bit Bazaar is on December 6th. That is next Saturday. And if you've never been to Bit Bazaar, it's really cool and you should come. Also, I'm showing there, so that's going to be great. Alongside that, Kara Stone is releasing her game Technoterra on the App Store with it, sort of in tandem. Some other cool stuff happening at Bento and Miso is the Intro to Unity workshop, run by a couple people who I can't remember right now, but it's happening on December 18th and it's going to be really good. And that is it for me. We have a couple people who want to make some announcements. First up, I'm going to call Christopher Young, who wants to do some research. Oh. Could have filled this time.
Hi guys, I'm Chris Young. I'm a researcher at the University of Toronto, and I'm looking at researching the groups and identities of hobbyists, game makers, and developers in Toronto. If you make games for fun, or you're looking to make games to break into the industry, I would love to speak to you about your experiences. So after the event, come find me, I'll just be over there. Or you can email me at christopher.young@utoronto.ca, or you can follow me on Twitter at chrisjyoung60. So, thanks.
Thank you. And Jason McIsaac come up here. He's looking for guest speakers.
Yes, hi. My name's Jason McIsaac. I'm with Sheridan College. We're starting up a new course in January, and we're looking for speakers on all topics relating to game design, be it interactive design, narrative design, coding, art, animation, you name it. I would very much love to speak with you. I've already spoken to a couple of you about possibly guest speaking. There's a nice honorarium, and you also get to throw things at my students because they're a captive audience. I control their grades and they have to take it. So yes, please come see me after the talk, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Two last things. Okay, on your chairs are just feedback surveys. If you have a pen, you fill them out and hand them to either me or Alex Hader, who's over the front. He put his hand up. And maybe I'll get Rhett to take some too. I don't know. Those are really, really great just for kind of gauging if we are, if we're bringing events that people are actually interested in. I'm hoping so. And on the back of it, it's sort of a new addition. It's been there for a couple months now, but we have a code of conduct. And that's just because it's a good thing to have. Just be cool to each other. And hopefully we'll never need to use any of the maneuvers that are outlined on the back. That's not the right word. Okay, let's start this because I can't talk anymore. We have 3 great talks tonight. The first up is Alex Martin, and his slides are tiny.
That's me. Hello.
Good job.
I already drank almost all my water. Okay, so I'm not a very good speaker, but I'm going to try anyway. I made some tiny slides because I thought they would blow up, but they didn't. And so when I made these slides, I was just kind of going along with my train of thought about level design. And now that I'm not on that train of thought anymore, I'm just going to go through my slides and follow along with a new train of thought based on my old train of thought. So level design, the art of filling in the blanks. I came up with that a while ago, and now I think it means something different than when it used to. And so the idea is that a level, when you make it, you can think about a level as this is like stupid programming terms. If you don't know anything about programming, this might not make sense to you. But there are things that happen before the level, and that includes stuff like the player learning things. Like, it's not just mechanical stuff. It's also, the player liked this or whatever. They talked to a character, and now they know what that character knows. And so you come into a level with a bunch of different maybe abilities, maybe it's preconceptions, and a bunch of stuff happens within the level, and then you've got stuff that can result after you play through the level. And so I found in the past that it really helps me to think about levels as like a very specific tool that you can use in a game with a sort of purpose. This space doesn't work. And so, so in this diagram has some crap in it. And so the idea is maybe you're the yellow player who goes along this arc and avoids all the enemies. Or maybe you're the pink player who has the ability to make my slides go when I don't want them to. Or maybe you're the pink player who, in a previous level 1, because for some reason this is level 2, learns how to go through walls. And so instead of kind of edging by the ghosts, you just duck through the wall and you go through them. And the blue player will just go through the enemies because they've got something that can attack them, and the red player just walks into a ghost and dies. And this is a lot of different paths through the same level. And in many games, there's only sort of one path. Like you enter into a level from one path in one state, and you exit the game in a different state, but there aren't really a lot of possibilities. And that's fine. I think it's really cool to think about all the different possibilities that can occur as a result of someone playing through a level. So in this very tiny bad example, you've got 2 possible states you can enter through the level, and then you've got the level which you have to design, and then you've got 3 arrows here and 1 arrow down there, and those can be whatever you want. I think this was supposed to be like, oh, you died, and now you're in the level again. And this is like, oh, you found a secret path, or you got a different object. And so if you think about, oh, I've got a microphone. And so if you think about levels, if you think about all of these weird possibilities that connect levels, it'll give you just more, let's see, what's the word? It'll give you more inspiration, I guess, to draw from when you're just thinking about what to fill the level with, which I think is really helpful. That's saying what I already said. Big slide. Right, so what is the purpose of each level? If you're thinking about what is the purpose of each level, after saying that, I felt very responsible, and so I wanted to make it clear that a level's purpose doesn't have to be like, oh, this level teaches you how to do something, or this level makes you feel a certain way. Well, actually, that's what this is, whatever. It can be, this level exists to make you feel a certain way. This is a picture of, I've never even got this far in this game, but it's after some boss fight in a Metal Gear Solid game, there's just this giant ladder that you climb. And that, like, if you think about that as a level, and then you think about it as having a purpose, it does have a purpose, it's just silly. I think it's just silly. I mean, I haven't played the game. If someone knows if it has a real purpose.
Probably a metaphor for something.
Oh. And that's a legitimate purpose for a level. Like, you don't have to think strictly in terms of, oh, that guy that gave a presentation once said my level has to have a purpose, so I can't just make like a pretty level where it's full of clouds. This is another picture, and it's of Spelunky, and I had that in there for some reason. The image, the slide is called Chaos, and it is also an example of sort of undesigned levels. If you don't know this, Spelunky is a game where you enter and it randomly generates a dungeon for you to wander around in out of pre-designed pieces. And so this game does have level design because the guy who made this game, Derek Yu, I assume he did the levels, he did them in the original, made these big chunks that kind of went to fit together. And he probably wasn't thinking about it in terms of, I'm sorry, I keep moving, you have to keep pointing the camera at me. He probably wasn't thinking of those chunks in these terms. And so I put that picture in there to remind myself and you that this isn't the only way to think about levels. Yeah. Sorry. All right, there we go. All right, so this is an example of just like a really basic way of thinking about levels, and this is like a trap that I think you can get caught in if you're thinking too strictly about how levels lead into one another. And so these keys, something I speak with disdain about is key and lock puzzles, which are just they're exemplified by walking around with not really much else to do, and you find a key, and then you go find a door, and you use the key on the door. And so if you're designing levels with that in mind, it's like, oh, here's level 1, this is where you get these 2 keys. Level 2, you need to use one of your keys to open the door, get the key. Purposeful but boring? I put a question mark there because I knew I wouldn't be sure what I was talking about. Oops, let's go back to level design. And later on through my train of thought, I was thinking too much, and I was thinking about if a level is a area that's a part of a larger whole, then isn't a level just like a bunch of small levels on one screen, a bunch of small areas? That's this slide. I'm glad you're still laughing. I just keep saying the same things. Okay. Oh, that's the end of my slide. Okay, so to gather my thoughts. I've got a notebook for just this occasion. Okay, so unrelated to this train of thought, for the most part, I don't know if you really understood it, any of you, but if you did, hopefully it was useful. I have TXT file. I'll just open my TXT file.
Make the font bigger.
Yeah, oh, I closed it. I want to make the font bigger, but I can't. Okay, so something that I find useful when going into level design, I will just talk about personal experience with level design. When I was thinking about how to do this talk, I realized that I didn't really know how to talk about level design, which is evident from my talk. I'm much better at talking about just kind of the things I do for myself to kind of push me into level design. And so the first thing that I always do when I start a project is think about whether it needs level design and what elements are going to need levels in what way. And so for example, if if you have a linear game as opposed to a large open world game, that will obviously need very different levels. When you're dealing with a linear game that you expect the player, or you force the player to go through one level at a time, you can reasonably design the levels so that they're interesting once and not so interesting the second time. But if you're making a game where you're expected to travel around and back and forth, you need to think a lot more about the arrow stuff I was talking about here. Hey. Is it even time here?
Use the mouse wheel to scroll. I mean to zoom.
There is no mouse wheel.
No, use the mouse wheel on the image. Or that.
You can see my slide. Right, so if you're making a game like Castlevania or Metroid, I will not use the term which is like the two together. You need to think about more than just these arrows, and it's so many arrows that I couldn't even draw a diagram for it, but you need to think about if you have unlockable stuff for someone to get, like they get a higher jump. Now you suddenly have like new arrows that you can only access with the higher jump. You want to get the most out of your mechanics in your level design. Okay, that thought fizzled out, sorry. All right, here. I have one good thought that I want to follow, which is if you run out of purpose, you've run out of levels. If you run out of or never had purpose in the first place, work on that. So if every level is, and this is like more weird programming stuff, I don't usually think in programming terms, but occasionally the connections appear. If you think about a level as like a block in a flowchart or a function in programming, and it has certain inputs, certain outputs, and you think of something that you want to explore in a game. So just to make a simple example, let's say you want to make a game about jumping, and that's it. You've just got solid objects, a little jumping player, and that's your entire game. If you want to make a game about that, you need to think about, well, okay, you don't need to, but this is the way I do it. You think about all the things that there are left to explore and left to see whether they're fun or not. And you make a level with a purpose like, is it fun to, or like, here, you need to learn how to jump on a thing. And so you make a level where you need to jump on a thing to complete the level. If you make another level about jumping on another thing, you're not really making a new level. You've run out of purpose there. then you move on to harder things. Can you jump onto a thing that's moving? Can you jump onto a thing that is very small and hard to jump on? And this would be a very short game if it was meant to be a brief game, and they listened to me. So right, I've run out of purpose. I've run out of slides. I think that's it. What was that? Like 5 minutes?
Cool, thanks. And he didn't say it himself, but Alex or Droqen, was it Droqen or Droqen? Droqen, I knew it. Made games like Probability Zero, Starseed Pilgrim, Fishbane, a bunch of really other cool stuff. So next up, sorry, we're not going to have questions right now. We're going to leave that until the end of everyone's talks, and you can just shout them out. Next up, we have Raigan and Mare from Metanet. They are going to be talking about level design and N++, and Raigan's not in the room right now. Oh, it's cool. It's cool. We can get set up. John, water. What do you want? Classic Raigan, never in rooms.
I think he has the smallest bladder of any human. Oh, hello.
Made it.
All right. We were just talking about your bladder.
Oh, yeah, sorry. It's very small.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay. I don't know. Try.
All right.
All right, so I'm Mare, and this is Raigan, and we're Metanet Software. And we're going to talk to you today about level design in N++.
All right, so level design. What is it good for? Level design it's pretty much just exploring. It's like a guided search. There's this really huge possibility space of all the levels that you could make, and you're kind of trying to figure the good parts and find them and understand them. So the rules and parameters of your game, all the different enemy types, the things the player can do, that's sort of like a language or a grammar or something, I don't exactly know. And then the level design is like using that given language to write a bunch of stuff, like a poem or a story or just phrases, something for the player to interact with. And so when your level design is really about teasing out the implications of the game design rules and figuring out, like, out of this gigantic, almost infinite possibility space, what are the fun, interesting interactions? What are the fun areas? And sort of riffing on that and exploring it. I don't know, it's basically just, it's exploration.
So, because the level design and the game design in N++ and lots of other platformers and games in general are so interrelated, we'll show you a video of N++ so that you can kind of get a sense of what the game is like, but there are a few key points about the game design that we thought we would mention first, because they really, really inform how we make levels and the types of levels that we make. So the first thing is, it's a single screen platformer, as you can see. So that means that there aren't any leaps of faith. The player always knows where they're going to land and like what enemies are on screen. There's never anything off screen or hidden that way that they're going to have to deal with. So that means that you get to see the level and plan out your route and then hit play and execute it. The second thing is, it's a very minimalist game, both in terms of the game design, but also in terms of the visual aesthetic. So basically, there's no visual clutter at all. Everything that you can see on screen has a particular purpose and has a particular behavior. So when you look at the level, you ideally know what everything is going to do, how everything on screen is going to behave. So that will help you as a player plan your route through that level and then execute it.
So the way that everything, it's very minimal, and the game design is sort of, we ruthlessly simplified as much as we could. And it wasn't intentional, but one of the side effects of that is that it became really easy and fun to make a level. And that's a big reason why we've made so many of them. So for instance, just like what I'm talking about sort of concretely for simplification is that all of the enemy logic and movement and behavior routines are based only on the tile data and the player's position. So the tile data is just like, I mean, it's the dark green stuff there, but it defines the solid region of space that you can collide with. And so the enemies, what I'm trying to say is there's no additional markup needed on part of the level designer, right? Like in a lot of games you have to place empty trigger volumes, or you have to place pathfinding information. There's all this additional stuff you have to define. So you can't just quickly move stuff around. But the design event is such that it's all modular and anything works. You can make any kind of tile combination. You can just move enemies and drop them wherever you want, and they'll just react accordingly. So that's really great because it means it's really fast and easy to change stuff. You don't have to redo any kind of work. It's like literally just the position of each thing is all you need to define. And it also, as Mare was saying, makes it really easy for the players to read and understand and predict what's going to happen. And like similarly, there's nothing in the game that's window dressing. There's no processing like bushes or little rabbits or anything that don't do anything. So we kind of, when you strip out all that extraneous stuff, it becomes super fast to make a level because there's just literally only the stuff that matters is there. I mean, that wouldn't work for every game, but it's a really interesting side effect of stripping it all down is that the level design becomes like an order of magnitude faster.
I think that's a good point. I don't think that a lot of the things that we're saying will apply to that many games, but we just thought maybe you'd find it interesting anyway, so hopefully that's the case. Okay, the next thing about the game design that we thought was important to mention is that it is a physics-based platformer, and so the way that it feels really affects the levels that you design. So you're a little ninja, and you have, inertia and momentum, and how fast you're traveling affects how high you can jump, or how the platforms that you can reach, basically. You can cover a lot of ground very quickly if you're moving very fast. So, I mean, sometimes we make a lot of levels that are very expansive and spacious so that you can do that because it's really fun to move around those spaces very quickly. And sometimes we make them smaller to kind of play with that, play what you're used to and give you a new challenge. So
Claustrophobia.
yeah.
Oh, right, sorry. So yes, and as a result of this sort of the loose physicsy movement of it, the game is itself a lot less rigid, and has a profound effect on level design. So like for instance, if you think about a game like 1001 Spikes, the player has 2 discrete jump movements, and they move at a fixed rate. So the range of what they can do at any particular point is really constrained. So if you make a little part of the level and you put the player there, you can basically annotate, here's the 2 or 3 things the player can do, and that's it. Whereas with N, you have so much freedom of movement that essentially we can't really lock down exactly what the player can do. And that's fun because it makes it a lot more open-ended. So instead of the game being sort of like a DDR-style execution task of, I, the level designer, set up this huge challenge, and here are the button inputs you have to press at these times to make it through. A lot of hard platformers are like that, but instead we really prefer for you to get to do both parts, not just the execution, but also the planning. So as a result, I kind of got sidetracked. Okay, sorry. Anyways, all right. So, and finally, the last piece of the level design is that something it's pretty common in a lot of games is that you have 2 sort of orthogonal, semi-orthogonal goals. So that you have the main goal of the game is to make it to the exit alive, and then you win that level and you go to the next level. The secondary goal is score, or it's your timer bar. So essentially the reason you want to collect gold is because it gives you a bit more score every time you do. And so the making it to the end of the level is like a hard constraint on the player. It's something we know the player has to do, and it really constrains their behavior in a rigid way. Whereas the gold is this soft constraint where they don't have to get it, they might want to get it. And so that's a super useful thing for adding sort of layers, where you can make a level that's very easy if you don't try to get the gold, but hard if you do try to get the gold. And that way it accommodates like a wider range of player skill, so we don't have to do as good a job of figuring out exactly where it fits, and we can just kind of play a bit fast and loose with the sequencing. And it just it adds a nice risk-reward, like the potential for risk-reward and more player decision-making kind of thing.
So we've been talking about N++, but this is just the final chapter of a series that we've been working on for 10 years. It started with N in 2004. So we've been making levels for 10 years. We've made approximately 5,000 at this point, which is over one every single day for the past 10 years. Every single day for the past 10 years. And almost one per day per person for the past 10 years, which is a whole lot of levels.
Awesome.
Thank you. I don't know. It's kind of cute, but it also, I mean, not every game, we definitely recommend that not every game do this. This was not necessarily a very good idea. However, so I guess the thing is, in that time, the game hasn't changed that much. Like, the core gameplay of N is consistent with N++, but the level design has changed a lot. Like, we've learned a whole lot over the past 10 years. We've grown a lot as level designers. Because that's kind of what's so important about this game, that's what makes you keep coming back and wanting to play more of these levels. Like, the core gameplay is great, but it's difficult to experience that if there's not like an interesting place to play around. So what we've basically learned is that, as you can see, you can create like a wide range of levels, a huge variety of different shapes and different styles, and each one has lots of different enemies and things like that. But it's about balancing them. So transforming all these levels into a game is about choosing a place for, you know, the really spacious levels or the really cramped levels, and making sure that they're evenly distributed among the entire game, so that as a player you get a sense of that variety and that, you know, vastness of the possibility space. So now we're going to talk a bit about how we actually make levels. Just a bit though. Generally the process is, and this is a frame by frame of making a bunch of various levels. So you start out with the tiles for a little bit, because you need some kind of scaffolding or architecture so that you can begin to think about the space that you're creating for players to move around in. But we generally move back and forth between objects and tiles, like as you develop that idea and as you figure out what it's going to look like. Basically, the process is that you kind of think about, as you're creating this space, how a player is going to move through it, and where you want to take them, where you want them to encounter different challenges, and what kind of emotional state you want them to have as you go through this level. And we kind of, like, we pass levels back and forth that we, like, I'll start one and Raigan will take a crack at it, and then, because it's kind of a really iterative process, and it's always refining and just kind of getting to the core of that experience.
All right, so I mentioned before that level design is like exploring the space, and I think a big part of the exploration is experimentation and play. And I think actually that's like, I think level design is the most fun aspect of game development, because it's the one that most resembles gameplay, because you're playing, you're just exploring, you're having fun, you're experimenting, you're trying stuff. It's like you have this giant virtual Lego set and you're just figuring out what works, and oh look, I can do this, and I'll like check out this thing that may happen. So it's just play, pretty much. And that lets you discover ideas. But it's not only play. I mean, I said it was just play, so I guess I was lying. But, because the thing is, there's ideas, and then there's like the well-realized, properly architected, thoroughly designed, fleshed out idea. And I find, like, personally, the ideas happen often accidentally. Like, I have an idea, oh, this could work, and so I try to make it work, and it totally doesn't work, but then I accidentally made something else happen, like, oh wait, this is even better, and then I follow that. And so it's great, generating these ideas is great, but I tend to save them as sketches of just like roughed out levels, because I find that if I get tunnel vision and I try to take an idea in one sitting from idea to fully finished level, I get super burnt out and all my energy drains away and it sucks. So I find that it's much more productive to have all your little ideas as sketches, and then when you're feeling maybe a bit less creative and a bit more engineering, you take one of them and then you start actually doing the hard work, which is like figuring out the exact spacing of enemies, figuring out like how, if I want these things to move this way, how should I divide them, and if I move things just a bit, how does that change the feel of moving through stuff? So it's like, it's not all play, but it's sort of, it starts with play. And iteration is the absolute most important thing by far. Because the raw ideas are good, but as you work on a game, as you make levels, you're always learning throughout the whole process. So if you return later to a level you made earlier, you're going to have a whole new perspective, and you probably have learned stuff. So a lot of our process involves making a level and then adding it to this giant database of all the levels, and then we just go through that every once in a while, randomly scanning through it and just looking for things that stand out, something that could be improved, something that's a bit awkward that we're like, oh no, we're not doing that anymore, I'm going to fix it up. And just sort of, it's, I don't know, just like endlessly going through and just working over the material again and again.
One thing that we've learned watching people play like in person and watching people play via replays, because all these games have built-in replays, it's really great, is that every player plays it a little bit differently. And it's based on sometimes, skill level, but sometimes personality. Sometimes people really love bounce blocks or rockets, and sometimes people really hate those things. So it's interesting to see how everyone goes through a level differently. And people generally play levels for different reasons. Like sometimes you just pick up a game for fun, or sometimes you're playing competitively, or you're trying to get a high score, or it's a party, and you just want to play some multiplayer or whatever. But there are all these different reasons that people play games, right? So we have to think about that when we design these levels, and think about how are we going to make this experience good for generally everybody? Because you can't just leave out the newbies who don't know how to play yet. You have to build levels thinking about how they're going to learn, how they're going to want to keep learning. But those levels can't be so easy that really experienced players, quit because it's so boring. So it's really difficult to balance all of that. And one thing that we do is we kind of create a bunch of different paths. So I think we have some examples where we sometimes design levels that have a hard path and an easy path. So if you're just starting out, you can take the easy path and just get the key and get to the exit. But if you're a more experienced player, you can take the harder path and go and get some gold, or there's an extra challenge for you on the top so that you're not just super bored. So up at the top there is a big room that's difficult to get to and get out of. And it's full gold, so there's a risk-reward thing. Yeah, I guess because that's sort of what this game is all about, that there are these moments that are really satisfying and also these moments that are really frustrating, but that the satisfaction derives from that frustration. Like, it's got to be a challenge, or else you won't feel any sense of reward when you finally get through it. So it's kind of about balancing that fine line right between those two things, so that we don't, make anybody rage quit too early. I mean, that's going to happen, we know that, but not too early.
So I think, finally, the most important thing, it's like pretty much with any other sort of creative pursuit, I think, is don't get burnt out. That's the most important thing. Try to change it up as much as you can, because I think you can really tell when someone phones in level design, or just stuff in general. Like, I think you can tell, but you can tell when there's love in something, you can tell when it's missing that love. So don't get burnt out. Try different approaches. Sometimes it's like, because like the only way we've survived and not gone crazy making thousands of levels is that we specifically try to come at it from every angle. So it's like sometimes we start with a name. Here's the name of the level. What does the level look like? And then go from there. Or a particular shape of tiles, or an arrangement of enemies, or just like a graphical theme. Like we see a pattern somewhere. We're like, oh, that looks like it could be a cool shape to move around in. And finally, you don't want to repeat yourself too much, because that gets boring. But it's really useful to revisit an idea 2 or 3 times in different contexts, because it's interesting for the player, because it's something they've seen, but then there's a twist on it. There's something different, and so they can use the previous knowledge, but then they have to deal with this new element or this change, and it's I don't know, it's fun to sort of build up a vocabulary, and then use that in different ways. But you really don't want to repeat yourself too much. Okay, so the other piece of the puzzle is tools. Tools are like massively important. We're not going to talk too much about it, but okay, well, yeah, okay, I'm just going to skip this. So, it's embarrassing shit. It's basically up until N++, we used text files. That was our organization method. Everything, the levels are plain text, and to arrange N+, there are like 500 levels, one text file And it was insane. It was so hard to not make any mistakes, to find stuff to organize. It just sucked. Everything. It was just, please use a spreadsheet. Use a spreadsheet. I'm sure everyone but us has been using spreadsheets for 10 years, but they're amazing. You can put different markup in each column. You can have a history of how the level has changed every time you edit it. They're just so you can search and sort. You can do all kinds of great stuff.
If this is the only takeaway from this talk,
Use a spreadsheet. Yeah, that's it for sure. Okay, also, iteration. So we mentioned iteration. Iteration is key. Now, in our editor, there is one button, and you press it, and you're immediately playing the game. Then you press again, you're immediately editing. And it's like by far the most important thing because it means that there's no delay between feedback, between when you have an idea and you change something, and then you seeing the implications of that change, because it's usually not what you expect, in my experience. I mean, we're not like super pros, but it's still surprising. Like, you just really never know until you experience it yourself. So, I mean, my metaphor that I like to use is it's like, imagine if you were trying to write a song, but when you pressed a key on your keyboard or your piano, it took like 30 seconds before you heard what it sounded like, right? That would be this really awkward, frustrating, stupid thing, and it would take all of the improvisation and fun and kind of riffing and get rid of that completely. So fast iteration, being able to just jump into your game and jump out is like, for sure, the most important thing in terms of making the levels good, I think, because it lets you always know exactly what's going on because you've played it and you've experienced it and you know that it's fun. And finally, level tools have a really interesting effect on the style, like on what sort of levels get made. Something we added in this one was region operations, which is like copy and paste and rotate, mirror, invert, stuff like that. Because we do a lot of repetition and variation, and we thought, oh, having copy and paste is going to be great. So previously we've tediously, hand by hand, tile by tile, copied the shape. This way we can just drag and select. But what ended up happening, I mean, that's true, that's certainly saved us time, but we actually found whole new procedures and methods of generating level shapes. Sort of like, I don't exactly know what op art is, but it's just generally, like one way is you take a small rectangular region and you just fill it with a certain shape of tiles, and then you copy that and rotate it and paste, and rotate and paste, and rotate and paste. And you can build up these, sadly we couldn't find any in time to show you, but you can build up these really elaborate and interesting shapes based on a small generating shape. And you often can't even tell what the generating shape was because there's just so much, I don't know, it's just a really, like, having these fun little tools is super important. And I urge everyone, it sucks. We personally have to write the tools, so we are the last people that want to add a feature because the editor is it's literally 500 or 5,000 lines of if statements. I mean, it's horrible. It's really bad. So mucking around in there is not something we want to do, but it for sure is worth it because it just I mean, this is sort of, it's like your instrument, right? You don't want to be playing the guitar with broken strings and stuff. You got to take the time to make the best instrument you can.
What's next? Okay, so we've talked a bit about how we make levels and levels individually, but the next kind of step to putting all that into a game is sequencing them. So in this series, we make episodes. So we put 5 levels together and call it an episode. And so it's like this little kind of bite-sized challenge. It takes about 5 minutes, let's say, to play. And it's a bit more compelling than just one level. You could play levels individually for different reasons. Like you could do speed runs. They're great for learning, whatever. But episodes provide a bit more of a challenge. And it lets us do interesting things with them. These are some examples of the variety. So each of these levels has a different kind of flavor. As you're playing it, some of them are more tense than others. Some of them are about the really satisfying way that doing, an exceptionally difficult jump and pulling it off, how that feels. But there are all these different moments in each level. So we combine those into episodes, choosing a really tense moment and then maybe a little break and just combining all these different things so that we create a little kind of story, it's got a narrative, it's got a progression. So that lets us combine these episodes into the episode grid. And the interesting thing about the episode grid is we've got all these kind of self-contained units that have a little progression, but players have a lot of choice in N++. You can start, I mean, in this example, any of those lighter pink squares would be episodes that are unlocked, you can play them. The darker pink ones would be episodes that you have already beaten, and the rest of them are still locked. But you have a lot of choice as a player about where you want to go and how difficult a level you want to play. And it gives us a lot of freedom as level designers to kind of construct that experience.
I think I sit in my seat. It's okay. All right, so Mare just talked about like the dramatic arc in a set of 5 levels. But there's also a dramatic arc within each level. So just as a quick example of that, this level. So this level has sort of what you could consider a triangular dramatic arc, where it builds to a peak and then it sort of goes down. So when you start at the top, you're in this space, sort of an upside down view space, where there's no enemies, there's nothing bad that can happen, you're totally safe, it's really fun, you can run around, whatever, it's great. When you get to the bottom, there's one enemy. And so now things are starting to get a bit tense and a bit exciting, and okay, you evaded it, that's good, you're a bit excited. Then you get to the middle section, and that's like when shit gets real, because it's super hard. It's really, really hard. There's all kinds of enemies, and it's just very, very difficult. But if you manage to make it out of there, that's sort of the peak of the triangle. And if you manage to make it out of there, now you're face to face with that first thing that you passed on the way in. And the first time, it was probably pretty easy. You're like, whatever, I just blew past that guy, who cares? But because you just went through this hellishly hard part and somehow escaped alive, now this tiny little enemy actually feels way scarier than it did the first time, because you know if this thing gets you, you're fucked and you have to do the hard part again. And it's like, it really absolutely makes the experience different, even though it's literally the same space and the same enemy. And then finally, once you've made it past that last enemy, there's this nice empty space. There's this emptiness where you cool down, you wind down, you get to feel like, oh, relaxed, like you're headed for the exit, and you're like, all right, good, I made it, I got it. And then often, you could screw up and slip and you'll fall to your death, and that's like the most hilarious thing. That's my favorite part. Right, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
So yeah, I mean, I guess that's basically how our job works as level designers. Just taking all those different kind of experiences and thinking about how players play this game and how they move through these spaces and combining them into this cohesive experience, like a cohesive whole that feels more like a game instead of a set of random episodes. Which, I don't know, I mean, it still kind of feels like a bunch of random episodes, but hopefully there's at least some progressive, interesting thread that keeps you as a player coming back. Yeah, I guess the other thing is, everything that we've said is not really anything that we knew going in 10 years ago. We just kind of picked this stuff up, but really it developed because we thought about what we were doing, or thought about which levels worked, or which people have told us that they really like, or which have produced replays that are really interesting to watch. So it's just about thinking about that stuff and then talking about it together and figuring out what the hell is going on. So that's what we've come to at this point.
Yeah, it's about iteration and revision and learning, and eventually you'll start to see patterns and you'll notice useful heuristics, and the most important thing is to remain playful and to explore the space. And then not just play and explore, but also reflect and try to understand what you just experienced. Everything, we don't actually know if this makes any sense. It's just what we happen to
Hopefully,
do.
but
So we want to finish with like a few more concrete examples of level design-y type stuff that might be of interest. Yeah, do we have time?
we got
5
time.
minutes? All right. So, Mare mentioned earlier the single screen. The game is single screen, and that is like a pretty big design decision, and it has all kinds of implications. So like one of them is, there's a limit as to how big a level can be, how long a level can be, how much space you can traverse, because you only have this one screen. So there are a lot of things you can do. I mean, one of our most common level shapes is a spiral, because that lets you sort of generate a huge length of level in a relatively compact footprint. But we also reuse space quite a bit. Like a lot of our levels, you have to go someplace and then go back through the space you've already traversed, and which is integral for a single screen game. Otherwise, you have no room to play with. The thing about reusing space is that there's a good way of doing it and a bad way of doing it. And really, the ideal is that if every time through the space, the context is different, it means that it may technically be the same space, but it feels like a different part of the level to the player. So for instance, in this level, you start on the left, and then you have to go to the right and down that first little appendix, and then back up there, and then to the left and down, and then up and all the way to the far right and down. So you're traveling through that middle hallway 3 times, and you're traveling up and down both of these things. But it's like up and down is one of our favorite things in terms of changing space, because in a platformer, left and right are symmetrical, so that doesn't really make any difference. But moving up through a space versus moving down through a space feels completely different, and it's a totally different sort of rhythm and skill set. So up and down is a really fun way of reusing a space. And on the right side of this level, there's an enemy, it's a rocket, and it will shoot at you, and you have to evade it. So one interesting thing about putting a rocket on one side of the level is that it means when you're moving towards it, it acts sort of as a brake. It slows you down because you have to take time to stop and evade it. And that makes traversing the top of the level feel quite different, and actually you have to take different kinds of jumps. Whereas when you're making a trip towards the left and the rocket's behind you, it has the opposite effect. You can't go, if you go slower than the rocket, it catches up with you and kills you. So it sort of acts as this, it's like a brick on the gas pedal, and that makes going through the top of the level, it's sort of really exciting and scary because you have to blaze through these dangers that on the way there you kind of took little baby steps to get past, and it feels really exhilarating and different. And I mean, finally, those little gray circles at the top, they're one of the new enemies we added, toggle mines. So when you touch them and then move off, they turn deadly. So you can move through them once. And we added, I don't know if you saw in the video, there's like an evil ninja enemy that does whatever you did 2 seconds in the past. So those two let us literally change the level. They were really good for letting us take a single space and actually making it change over time and making it so that it actually is like a different level each time you move through it. All right, so we talked about how gold is useful. There's like a risk-reward thing, and it's sort of a way of accommodating a range of player skills. So in this example, there's a rocket in the middle, which is quite hard because of all those mines which slow you down. But then you start on the left, and that little spiral shape, that's one of the evil ninja spawn points. So if you try to get that gold, you're going to trigger the evil ninjas, and they're going to chase you as the rocket's chasing you. So it's like the level becomes super hard with those ninjas. It's like doubles in difficulty. But it's really fun to have that there because then we can put this a bit earlier, and expert players won't be bored. And I mean, anyone who wants to get a high score is going to have to get that gold. So it's like sort of an extra challenge. And so like just the whole idea of level design, we think, should be about setting up scenarios for the player to react to. It's level design where it's just sort of like a dog trainer going like, do this, now do this, now do this, now do this. It can be fun, like Guitar Hero is fun, but it's not quite as fun as when the player themselves is improvising and they're reacting and they're really getting involved in the thing and they're not just sort of doing drills. So risk reward is a big thing for that because it lets people sort of bite off however much they want to chew. And so gold score is one of those things. Similarly, shortcuts. So in the middle of this level, there are those 2 mines, and you can sort of drop through them, and that's like a shortcut that lets you skip a whole loop. And again, so shortcuts are a great way of sort of letting more expert players, giving them more options, letting them take risks, and that lets them keep the level exciting. Otherwise, it might be a bit boring because there's just not enough danger for them. Whereas new players don't have to. And I mean, this one actually serves double purpose because if you're going to go through it, it's this dangerous thing, but you still have to jump over it anyway. So it sort of acts as sort of a spike pit danger as well as a shortcut. And it's hard to explain because like you'd have to see it in motion, but the lasers are continuously shooting the top. So any kind of jumping in that hallway is really dangerous because you're moving into the zone where they can kill you. Okay, I mean, that's about it. I would like, yeah, we're going to say some stuff about grids and no grids. There's regularity, and that's really cool because it lets people read the situation a lot better, right? Like once you've made one of these jumps, you know exactly, okay, I can jump up 2 blocks, I can do this jump, that jump. Grids and regularity really let people parse stuff really quickly, and it lets them quickly identify and isolate the options, what the possibilities are, which can be good, especially if it's a really hard level like this, where you can't be trying to figure out what you're supposed to do. You just have to, again, you can't tell in motion, but this thing is crazy once those things are moving. But also, irregularity can also be super interesting because, again, it like makes the possibility space sort of bifurcate and adds all these, it's like, which way do I go? Which branches? It's so not obvious what the best way of jumping through this minefield is. And I mean, we didn't even know when we made it, but the high scorers figured out the most optimal route, which is super, like, that's a super fun thing too. Anyways, that's it.
All right, 2 down. Let's do it. Next up, we have Jason Canam from DrinkBox Studios. You were at the Guacamole event last month at OCAD. Turns out that Jason Canam is the best at video games. And he's going to tell you why he makes hard levels or something. I don't know. Right? That's close enough.
Kind of.
Yeah.
I should have never asked that question.
It was a fair question. It was a good question.
Why are you so good at video games, Ken?
That was not what I said. That, for the record.
Sweet.
Okay.
How's that? Excellent. No point delaying, we will jump right into it. So yeah, I'm Jason from DrinkBox Studios, and I'm going to talk to you today about level design. So welcome to my talk. Lead by example, level design is a delivery system for game mechanics, creating levels through meaningful expansion of game systems, a primer. Super Turbo Championship. So yes, level design, as I'm going to be speaking about today very specifically, I like to think of it as the delivery system for game mechanics. Game mechanics being the rules by which the player interacts and plays the game. Then the levels are the areas, the playground, that you've given them in which to use those mechanics. So really what does that mean about the game mechanics being the heart of the game and its systems? And so by creating the level, you're giving the place to use those mechanics. The level design is what dictates that the level itself needs to adhere to, complement, and show off these mechanics. If you make a game about jumping and there's nothing to jump over, then that would be an objective bad level design. It's not taking advantage of what the game is about or doing. So a level, yeah, obviously doesn't work if it's not taking advantage of the game mechanics. When building levels specifically, you need to know what the player can do and what the player is able to do. Now those are two different things. What the player can do is, from a mechanical standpoint, what you've given them to do. Have you given them the ability to jump? The ability to fight? And so, are you giving them things to jump over? Are you giving them things to fight? And then what the player is able to do is more of the skill-based question. So you've given them things to fight. Well, you need to give them easy things to fight and difficult things to fight and variations of those to create challenging scenarios for the player. And that fundamentally is just kind of basic level design 101. And this is a shot of this is a screenshot of Guacamole as seen in like the DrinkBox tool as I'm building levels. This is how it looks when I'm working with it, and then you've all seen the game and how pretty it looks once the actual art team can make it look fantastic. But today, the specific topic I want to get into is what I call mechanic expansion. So that is kind of the process that I've used in level design. I'm going to be giving some examples, but it's the process by which you develop more gameplay, not by introducing new mechanics, but by expanding upon the mechanics you've already introduced into the game. And there are very specific reasons why there is a differentiation there, as I'm going to get into. So it's not expanding into new mechanics, it's not giving the player new things, it's taking the things they already know and can do and finding new ways for that to be interesting. So that's why I like new versus new. The most important thing about introducing any kind of gameplay element to the player is you cannot avoid a learning curve. If you give the player an ability or a task, they're going to need time to figure it out, they're going to need time to get used to it. You can't escape that. Whether or not it's a minimal amount of time, or whether or not it's a great deal amount of time in the case of like a puzzle or something you want them to figure out. One of the big factors in that is input. Anytime you're introducing something to the player where you're giving them a new button to press, that takes much more time than a mechanic wherein they're using a button they've been using before. So if the player's been jumping the entire game with a certain button, and then you introduce a new type of jump, they'll learn that much more quickly rather, than if you gave them a new button to use. And when using these mechanics, when using these concepts for level design, it's really useful if you play into and against player expectations. And that means giving scenarios that are a little obvious, giving scenarios where people can follow that train of logic immediately, like, oh, I get that, that's really interesting. And then playing against player expectations is kind of the element of the game, especially with a game like Guacamelee, where you're hiding things. It's sort of like you're letting players, they understand they have a move that's used for one thing, like, oh, the uppercut hurts guys. And then later on they realize, oh wait, no, the uppercut also gets me up onto higher ledges because it carries me upward. And that's kind of the heart of what I'm going to be talking about. So how do you expand on an existing mechanic? And why is it important? Well, an expanded mechanic, as I described, it requires less learning by the player. There's ideally no new input, no brand new concept, but you're just taking the concepts they're already familiar with and kind of just twisting and shaping them into new concepts. And an expanded mechanic, as I'm kind of defining it, is mostly contextual situational. You're taking something that they've already been using, you're giving it a new context. And I'm going to be showing you some examples of this, very specifically, from Guacamelee's Super Turbo Championship Edition, in which these are techniques I used for the level design of that game. It was an enhanced, updated version of the game. So we had to think about ways in which we were going to take the game that was already balanced, was already complete, and find ways in which we could expand upon that, make it better, make it more interesting. And the first example of that I'm going to talk about is what I call non-combat combat. There were a couple of little mini games put into the game, one in Guacamelee and another one that I added for Guacamelee Super Turbo Championship Edition. And that is, there's a mini game in the Canam de las Flores where you have to sort out rival gangs of crabs in a crab shack. Now, why? Firstly, so the main characters of the game, Juan and Tostada, the characters the player plays, they only really have one way of interacting with the world, and that's through combat. Players, when they play the game, the way in which they're experiencing traveling, interacting with characters, interacting with enemies, interacting with the world, fundamentally it's all done through punches. Punches kind of solve everything in Guacamelee. But that's because that's the lexicon we gave the player to use with. The player communicates to the game with their punches. They solve their puzzles with punches, they defeat the enemies with punches, they fix everyday problems with punches. So using the lexicon we gave the player, that's what I made the tool set that they're going to be used to solve this minigame. You come across an old man in the village, he tells you that crabs are running wild in this crab shack and he needs you to sort them out. So the player uses the only thing they have at their disposal, which is their combat abilities, and they're using them in a non-combat situation. So you run around, you can punch, you can grab and throw the crabs, which are all of the abilities that you also use on the enemies of the game. So it is a bit of a diversion. It's one of the game's pseudo side quests. You get a reward of a health upgrade for completing it. But once again, this is kind of taking something outside of its regular context and applying it to a new situation. And so yeah, everything that you've learned. And at this point, the player will have been playing the game for roughly between 1 or 2 hours based on a first playthrough. And so they will have been reasonably comfortable with the combat. One thing this highlights specifically is being very accurate with the way you throw enemies. In moment-to-moment combat, you don't always have to be extremely accurate when you throw guys. You know that if you weaken a guy, you grab him, you throw him, he's probably going to die. Or at the very least, you've increased the distance between you and him, you've gotten him away from you, he's not a threat anymore. In this place, you have to more carefully aim your throws to get them into the 2 bins on each side that are color-coded. Secondly, which is my favorite mechanic that was added, which I call dimensional behaviors. In Guacamelee, players got the ability to dimension swap, which was the ability to switch back and forth between the worlds of the living and the worlds of the dead. This was very important because it was frequently used in the game, but also, and this was just happy coincidence and really glad it worked out this way, it's narratively important to the game. It's important to the story that they travel back and forth between the world of the living and the world of the dead. So it's something that resonated with players, it's something they remembered after the experience. It was important to use to complete the levels, but also the story of the game was about traveling back and forth between these 2 worlds. So that made it something that players found memorable and remembered how to use. So in the game, I expanded on that concept. In Guacamelee, as I'm going to show, I'll show right to the video. So in Guacamelee, the original version, switching back and forth between the dimensions fundamentally just made walls appear and disappear. In this case, the player is swapping back and forth between the worlds to make the walls phase in and out of existence so they can climb to the top of the Tule tree. In Guacamelee Super Turbo Championship Edition, what was done was we took the concept of that, and instead of just making walls appear and disappear, it actually affects the behaviors of objects in the world. In one dimension, there are spires of lava that shoot up from the lava pools that will kill you if you touch them. In the dimension of the dead, there's solid rock. So as you switch back and forth between the worlds, you're affecting the behavior of the level, changing deadly zones into safe zones, or in this case, there are platforms that change the direction of travel depending on which of the dimensions you're in. So you need to be switching back and forth between the 2 dimensions to be able to control the movement of these platforms to be able to safely navigate the room. And so this is very familiar to players. Both, if they play the first game, they'll remember dimension swapping and they'll know how to use it. But even if their first time playing the game is with the Super Turbo Championship edition of the game, this area of the game is late in the game. All of the zones where you use the typical use case of dimension swapping appear earlier in the game. This is towards the end of the game, and this is the point in the game when lots of game mechanics are kind of all coming together to use at once. Another one of this is probably my favorite room in the entire game. It's one of the game's combat arenas in which we lock you inside of a room, doors typically appear in, and then enemies are spawned in, and you have to defeat them before you can move on. In this case, I created a room which I put a lava pool that instantly kills you across the bottom, and lined it with the green blocks. The green blocks are destroyed when you use the downward slam move, and then I spawned in enemies that can only be damaged by doing the downward slam move. And this comes down to planning versus execution, which is the main point I'm going to be getting into. I put a little bullet point there that I'm just a jerk and I think carelessness should be punished. You need to be mindful of your surroundings. I like to enforce that, maybe heavily, but I like that. But in this case, I took a powerful ability and turned it into a weakness. Now this affects players who perhaps were relying on the ability as a crutch and were using it too often in the game, or simply were using it without thinking of when and how they were using it. And the idea is that it makes the player rethink their usual strategies. They've done dozens of combat arenas before this point, and most of the strategies they perhaps relied upon may not make sense for them anymore. So there's multiple solutions to getting through this room. I'm going to have a video showing a few of them. But basically you have your basic strats, which are an element of planning and an element of execution. And then the safe strats, which I'm going to be talking a lot about strats from here on out. Save strats require further planning, but less of the moment-to-moment execution. So it's about planning ahead, having a plan of attack, but not so much about the twitch-based kind of reactionary reflex playing. And then swag strats are less about planning, thinking ahead, and more about the moment-to-moment execution. So I'm showing a video of that room. So yeah, this is like a typical way of fighting through it. You'll see that when you perform the slam move on one of these enemies to destroy their green shield, you also destroy the blocks. So you create a situation in which enemies can die, because they also die if they go inside the lava, but also you've made the room much more deadly for yourself to get around while you're fighting the enemies. And then for one final part, I put a little tree for anyone that gets that far, and a bunch of enemies that just throw themselves into the lava. So I'm a charitable guy. So next, so this is the much more complex version. This is the swag strat. And this involves an advanced technique where you cancel out of the move as it connects with the enemy. You perform a dodge cancel so it doesn't go through all the way to the ground. So this is the way that a very advanced player would do it. Like I said, it doesn't involve much forward thinking, but if you have the moment-to-moment reflexes, you can actually completely disarm the room and make it not a threat anymore. The safe version, which I didn't record, but the alternate version of that is if you think ahead and take advantage of your Intenso super ability, which is an ability you learned early on in the game, it supercharges your character into an advanced form. That immediately destroys all of the protective shields on the enemies, and then you can just regularly punch them to death. Also, completely neutralizing the threat of the room. And as we said, it comes down to whether or not it's a very high risk type of player that's relying on their moment-to-moment reflexes, or kind of the type of player that plans ahead. So strats. And as was mentioned before, the different strategies and play styles of players it's their form of expressiveness. It's how they express themselves through your game. And if the level design is a two-way communication, then the level you've created is how you're communicating to them, and how they play it is the feedback they're giving you. It's the communication back to you. And talking about strats, you have to talk about something that's really kind of important to me, speedrunners. Speedrunners are kind of just the best. I'm going to show off a speedrun strat for another one of my favorite rooms in the game, and you'll kind of see how hilarious it is when speedrunners tear it apart. So this room, the Pico secret room, is a secret room in the game. It's very difficult, but it's tucked away in the side, so not every player plays it, only those who are seeking out the game's secrets. You emerge from the left side. You're inside of a room where you have 3 blocks that move around the contour of the room, counterclockwise, while the exploding floating enemies spawn in the middle. So you have to air fight combat them while constantly jumping to the next platform that spins around. Your reward for completing the room is a chest with an upgrade in it. And so it's a very tough challenge that gives you a nice reward. But then, good old members of the Guac community, which is the Guacamole speedrunning community, they had kind of other plans for the room. So this is a player entering the room. So uses the reach of the headbutt move to just smash the chest and get the upgrade, and then lets the block just push them through the exit door, and then they leave, never having finished the room at all. And I love, that makes me happy. Nothing in the world makes me happier than seeing that. That is amazing. So how does this relate to level design? We're talking a lot about skill, about strategies, not really about level design. Well, the level design, once again, is the serving system for those mechanics. So keeping in mind how you're designing, and you can't always anticipate it, but if you think about the level design as enhancing the mechanics, and you give more contextual situations within the level to use the mechanics, then it's kind of like an exponential growth of you have that many more possibilities that people will interact with it with the different mechanics, and you'll have all kinds of different ways of playing the game, and you'll get situations like that. So these kind of levels have, as I explained, the best kind of eureka moments. When someone figures out, oh wait, no, this room has been built for this, but I know the reach of this move can reach past this barrier that's there. Or, like my favorite thing I love hearing people say is, oh, I get it, mechanic X can also be used for situation Y. And that's really like the best kind of revelation that a player can have. And more mechanics equals more strats. So in terms of level design, mechanics fundamentally are actually more important to player exploration and discovery than the locations. And by that I mean exactly what I said before, which is that when you build something, it's really how they're going to interact with it more so than what it is. That's going to be interesting for them. And having more uses for mechanics and these kind of very interesting contextualized situations gives players more chances to develop these approaches and strategies and strats. 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 And that's it.
Hello? Oh, cool. Okay, so now we're going to do some questions, if that's cool with everybody. We've got, I don't know, like 20 minutes probably. So if I can get everyone who spoke, I guess, to come back up here. I'm going to walk around with this microphone. Maybe I'll get Alex Hader to come help me so I can go pee. And yeah, if you have any questions for anyone who spoke, just, I guess, address it to them. That's it. I'm going to go to the bathroom.
Thanks, John.
Any questions? I have a question. I guess when you have a game like M+, and you've designed so many levels, how is the editing process? Because, you know, when you have so many levels, you always have a bottom 10%, you know?
It's really long, for one thing. How long do you think it takes us to play through all levels now? In M++, like 2 hours?
Yeah, each level takes about, per level?
Yeah.
Yeah, like in the end, each level costs hours of time. But I mean, the thing is, we've got rid, like we maybe have made like 5,000, I mean, we only have about between 2,000 and 3,000 good ones that might be in the game. And then the rest are sort of in progress, but our in progress file is actually like, it's like more than 5,000 half-finished levels kind of thing. So the editing process is basically, one of us makes it, that takes 30 to 45 minutes. Then we play through it together and we talk about it and we rank it. If it's not good enough, it goes back with comments and we'll fix it up. Or if we don't know how to fix it, whatever, it's gone. Then that gets into the database. And then when we go through, we try to arrange levels and stuff, and then when we notice then that a level is, oh, it's not that good, then we flag it and it gets out. And it's like, so stuff just keeps getting kicked out, but if it gets kicked out, it has a comment on it, like, this part sucks, or it's whatever. So either we fix it and it comes back in, or it doesn't, but it's basically like it's all editing. The whole thing is, it's mostly editing, because we make so many levels, and then it's just a matter of figuring out. And honestly, we kind of cheat, because the way that it works is like we make all these levels, and then when we go to make the game, we pick our favorite ones. Like we go through all the levels,
Every single one.
and we like vote on sort of what's the quality of this one, and then we take the best ones out of that and make the game with those, and the rest are DLC where we've launched the game. Now we have 3 months to go through those levels and make them all. Like we bought ourselves time. Now it's like now we have to make these ones that weren't quite good enough somehow.
Good enough to be like voted into the next chapter.
But it's actually cheating because we've throughout the time we were learning. So like the thing is, when we made N+, we had just introduced co-op and we really didn't understand how to make a good co-op level until we finished the game. And so the co-op levels in that game are not super strong, but the DLC co-op levels are amazing because in that intro period, I think they're pretty good. We were able to figure out all the stuff that we didn't know. So I mean, I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's like,
Mostly editing.
it's mostly editing.
Hey, let's just say you're making a game that has procedurally generated levels. What kind of common pitfalls or any tips that you might be able to share with a company that might happen to be making a game like that?
That's you. I guess that's me. Usually the way I do procedural stuff is I just throw things into lines of code and then I play them a lot and then I change small things until it's good.
All right. I was just going to jump in saying that when doing something that's procedurally generated, like Alex mentioned Spelunky, really you just want to make sure things fit. Like they are chunks of level that have been designed, and then they kind of get arranged in a certain way, and there's like a few tiles that fill in the gaps. Really, the way I approach it is that as long as things will fit together, and you don't have crazy weird things like, oh, we have water that floats in air over here. Beyond that, the kind of chaos that can erupt from that is exactly what you're trying to get. So you don't want to be too heavy-handed with how you're doing that. So cover your bases so that you don't have technical flaws. And then, yeah, whatever craziness can happen beyond that is all a ton of goodness. It's all useful.
Something that's really useful in procedurally generated games is to, like, one of the advantages of it, and also one of the things that you should do, is give them abilities that are limited but more powerful than you have in most games, like the ability to destroy walls like you can in Spelunky, because that can, it's a fun thing to add to the game because it's a limited resource that they have to figure out when they want to use it, and it's also good because if it screws up and there's actually no way to the exit, you're okay.
When expanding upon mechanics, you're probably going to find a bunch of different aspects. Now, if you have like multiple mechanics which you're expanding upon, do you think that some sort of cross-combination of them would lead to a similar result, as opposed to just like expanding upon a specific mechanic?
Sure. So the question is, if you're trying to expand on many at once in a single situation, can you still wind up with like kind of the same result?
Yeah, because sometimes you don't have like I find that you don't have enough scope or time. Oh, sometimes I find that I don't have enough time or to explore each mechanic individually. So sometimes it's like you got to explore a bunch of them and see what kind of stuff could combine with what, and from there you might get interesting. I find that you might get interesting gameplay.
Sure. I mean, I didn't go into that much detail with what I was explaining, but especially the one mechanic I was explaining in the video with the lava that becomes solid, fundamentally the base of that is that switching between the dimensions is what makes it solid or dangerous. But the only way you can get through that area, and while I wasn't explicit about it, you still need to be able to cling to walls, which is an ability you get throughout the game, and now you're clinging onto something that can move, which you weren't doing before. You need the double jump to be able to get through there. So actually it was, and that's a good point that maybe I should have been more explicit about that. But typically the farther you go on, you almost can't avoid developing on multiple ones at once. That's what's just going to naturally happen. And what's good about the process is that, yeah, it will kind of just give you the same result. It may sometimes be a happy accident, but you will kind of always, it'll work out that way. So you don't need to think actively like, I'm expanding on 3 or 2 or 1 here. Fundamentally, it'll all just kind of complement itself and will work out.
Obviously, while working on games, you play the freaking crap out of your levels. How do you continue to manufacture good levels for the new Blitz?
Us?
Well, just anyone in particular.
All right.
I'm assuming like you would be a good example, seeing as you spent 10 years on.
I mean, honestly, we don't do a very good job of making easy levels, and they're the hardest ones to make because to make them engaging without being hard is really difficult.
Like we have a couple strategies for that. Like one we talked about was we make a difficult path and an easy path so that, you know, if you want to, you can experiment, you can learn a bit more and take the more challenging path. But another strategy is to, wait, what was I going to say? Oh God. Crap.
Okay, well, I think maybe part of the question is like, how do you make sure you don't just make everything too hard because you're good at the game? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I mean, part of the thing is we sort of did that because we didn't know any better, but it turned out that people like really hard levels. So we, like, because I mean, people figure it out. That's sort of like a really, I mean, yeah, there's a limit to it. But honestly, I mean, to be honest, what our process really is we make the game, then we show it at a trade show, and we're horrified when people can't make it past the first level, which it's happened every time. And then that makes us so horrified that we go home and immediately make everything easier. And then we repeat that like 3 or 4, and about by like the 4th time we've shown it and no one can play it still, then we're like, okay, we're not making it easier, so I guess screw it. But like,
I remember what I was going to say. Another thing that we try to do is every enemy makes the level, you know, that much harder. So the challenge of making an easy level that kind of introduces enemies is you can't just keep piling them on. Like our natural tendency is just keep throwing stuff at levels because we like that. We like those challenges. But we also try to make levels that are just about the experience of moving through the level. So for this game in particular, for N++, a lot of those jumps or, you know, jumping up a wall really fast is really satisfying as an experience. So we try to make easier levels that kind of focus around that, those like just moving through the space, because that can be compelling too.
it's always better with a rocket. That's one of my weapons.
It's time for a few more questions. Anyone?
Do you guys find it difficult, is it easier to make a level with candy involved? With candy so the players can travel along and find it? Or is it easier to use enemy placements? I know it's a weird question, but like, is it easier to make a level when you just have, oh, there's a collectible, you can grab that? Then you can kind of get them to go on a little bit of a journey? Or is it hard just to like design a level in a way that they want to go there? I don't know if my question makes sense.
Well, I mean, if you're designing a level in a lot of games, it's pretty obvious where you have to go. I think that maybe the harder thing is just being careful where you put the candy, because you don't want to just have it everywhere, because then it, like, especially if you have it everywhere that the player already wants to go, because then it kind of serves no purpose except for just to make a noise as they move along.
Yeah, that's something that we've gotten a lot better at over the 10 years is like, if they're moving there already, you generally don't want to put down any coins or whatever, because, yeah, like what's the point? You've just wasted, you've devalued the coins. If you only use them in ways that connote, that mean something, that way when people see it, they'll read the meaning. If it's half the time it's noise and it's just random gold, and half the time it's meaningful, no one's gonna like, they're not gonna see when you signpost something with a bunch of gold, they won't get it, because they'll be like, oh yeah, there's gold everywhere. It doesn't make a difference where gold is. So.
Do any of you guys find yourselves sketching out level design ideas on napkins at restaurants?
Yeah, sometimes. We try to, like, our level editor is so easy that, and we don't go out much, so we're generally like within walking distance of the level editor, so it's always faster to do it in the editor. Like, I think this is pretty much the sign that you have like, this should be the case always. If you aren't doing this, if you're sketching on paper first and then transcribing into your tool, you have a really bad tool, because that's garbage, right? Because the paper's not reactive. You can't do anything with paper. I mean, yes, if you're in a restaurant, you have to do that. And we've done it like on vacation. We don't have a computer or something, Post-it notes. But like, the tool that you're using to make the game should be your scratch pad for sketching out ideas quickly, because otherwise, it's clearly, it's slowing you down.
I grew up with your guys' editor, like with the N editor, so I think that's heavily informed what I look for in editors, because I think most of them
it's not a good editor. Like, I mean, it uses literally, the new one literally uses every key in the keyboard including the numpad.
It's amazing. You don't have to move the mouse around to click.
Once
Just
you've
click the
learned
key.
it, it's like you can do
It's amazing.
stuff so fast, but it's the one he's talking about. It's insane anyone ever used it because to save a level, you have to press like insert
Oh my god.
1S and something like there's these arcane hotkey sequences, and if you screwed it up, it would dump.
Which of course you do,
Yeah,
all the
you
time.
lose your level. So
It's a lot
the
of
new
fun.
one is good, but it's amazing that anyone used the original one because it's so bad. It's really bad.
I'll jump in and counterpoint that with an example real quick. For Guacamelee, for one of the new levels, because the DrinkBox tool is kind of really useful and it's the same kind of thing. It works kind of the same way, but when we started developing that, they just said, build a new level. So I went, okay, and I just jumped straight into the editor without any planning, and then I built this super giant level that took 2.5 hours to beat and was the biggest thing ever. It was bigger than the rest of the game put together. And it was giant, it was huge and crazy and insane. And then we kind of stepped back, and then I did just a paper pass and kind of edited it, and then went back in. But in that sense, and that was also because the game is very narrative focused. So I kind of had to much more easily plan, well, you need to go here because you want to do this. You want to sneak in the bottom of the volcano, fight the reactor, and then go up to the top. But from a moment-to-moment standpoint, when you're planning things like jumps, when you're planning things like, I have a very specific situation, yeah, it's much easier to just throw that in the editor, F5, dead, okay, fix that again. What's that? Yeah.
One thing is, I have drawn like a couple of maps, but just for like the framework of a very large idea that I would then fill in with small levels.
Mhm.
But when it's something that you can hold very easily in your head all like at once in an editor, I've never bothered to draw something that is.
It's really hard too, because I mean, you can't tell if the idea is good at all until you actually try it. Like we've definitely like half the stuff we've written on Post-its, it's like you try, you're like, this is just stupid. Like,
Yeah.
so I mean, yeah, I think that, yeah, I guess it's definitely useful sometimes, but like, be wary of doing too much paper design.
One more quick question.
That green guy had his hand up for a really long time.
Okay, 2 more questions.
Yes. Thanks. Oh, sorry.
Once you get Link, you sort of have everything figured out in terms of mechanics and stuff like that. When someone comes along and really just like, sort of like with your Guacamelee example, like a speedrun just totally breaks what you had, do you sort of look at it and say, well, maybe when I make a level, I should sort of take this in consideration and make sure they can't do something like this, or take it in consideration and make something that sort of uses that in your level?
Excellent question. So in terms of that, one thing we've done that actually the community has been really receptive to and positive about is that we actually haven't patched stuff after they found it. We haven't patched out stuff that they found. We were like, no, I'm going to keep it in. Much worse is the problem with it. Anyone breaking the game, I think, is awesome. Like, all that. The only time we fix is when it's too hard. Anytime, the same kind of thing, whenever it goes to a trade show. Last E3, I was still in Toronto, and I was prepping a build early in the morning because the day before, no one could beat the room I built. So I was getting a new build ready and shipping it out to the guys in LA. In that case, we do want to make changes. But if someone happens to figure out, that's an honor. That's super cool. That's my absolute favorite thing. In terms of incorporating it into levels, there are a few of like the speedrunning techniques of the sequence breaks that we kind of talked about. And a couple of the guys were like, oh, we should take one of like the optional upgrades and hide it behind like one of these type of techniques. Like there is a technique where you can actually climb up walls vertically before you get the ability to do that. And someone suggested like setting that up so you have to do that. And ultimately I thought against it because you're dealing with less than a fraction of a percentage of your player, of 1% of your players that are doing it. And Actually, a lot of the things the speedrun community can do, none of us internally at the studios can pull off. There's a few of them. There's a couple of them, a couple guys, I can't do a lot of them. There's a couple of crazy moves that guys do in speedruns and stuff that I knowing what they're doing and even knowing the code and knowing exactly what frame they're doing it on, I can't do it. So I think like hiding it that way would alienate too many players. But keeping the stuff in, I'm all for it, 100%. Sequence breaks are the best.
Semi-related. There are like a lot. People found all kinds of bugs in movement code, and they use them to do crazy things. But there was one in particular that we actually made more of an on-purpose game mechanic in N++, which is that previously there's like corners of things. You're a circle, like logically you're a circle in the game. And so you can graze things and you can be in contact with a corner of something for literally 1 frame. And so people got really good at doing these corner jumps where they would jump on the exact frame when they were touching the corner, because otherwise you just kind of move through it. So we just added a bit of buffering so you could be like 6 frames early or late. That, like, because we couldn't do it. So now we can do it semi-reliably. But we don't, the thing is, we definitely, like, and there are all these expert tricks that we're aware of, we definitely don't use them. You don't have to know them to beat the levels, because the users will make levels that require them and they can have fun. But we have kept them in mind when we're designing levels, in that like sometimes we might put some gold somewhere where you need to use one of these sort of expert maneuvers to get to it. So you don't need to know it, but then it's really good to be, I mean, we kind of were cheating because we've put the game out a couple times, so we've already experienced a lot of the exploits and the type of thing people do. So now we can keep that in mind when we're designing stuff and be like, oh wait, I can see this. Actually, there's one, I don't know if we're going to include it, but we have one level where it's like this little level, you start next to the exit, and there's all this gold. And you have to do one of those corner jumps to get up to the goal, but it's super hard to understand. It looks like an impossible puzzle if you aren't aware of it. So.
So I have a question about, quite often a lot of these levels you see some repeating motifs, like the arrangements of platforms or power-ups. And I'm curious about how much you find your work that's coming out of functional needs, like you need to have particular metrics for it to be beatable, or you want to hint the player through a familiar layout, and how much is just from your kind of creative signature on the level that it's creating the look you want or the style.
I'll go
Sorry,
first.
it's not quite the question.
I'll just jump in with my quick little anecdote about like you said, the arrangement of kind of set pieces, platforms and stuff in a level. That I don't really have to a science. I'm just kind of, I don't like symmetry for the most part, unless it's necessary to the game design. So when doing some stuff like that, like I quite frequently will design a room and like I'll set up a series of platforms that are like your optimal jump arc to like, get across. And then I'll just kind of randomly nudge them in random directions, just so you can get that little weird variation, because I just like that more. Whenever I see things that are too perfect, especially if you're creating an organic level, like a tree or something, and I'm like, wait, why is there a staircase of branches? That's kind of dumb. But I do find myself just wanting to make little adjustments to keep things from being, I do mostly prefer to keep them like off a grid as much as possible, except for when it's really useful, as Raigan and Mare explained, about like, setting up familiar scenarios for players.
We really love symmetry. A lot of our levels are very, very precise and symmetrical and grid-based, but it's kind of nice to be able to move away from that and give the player something completely different. And at that point, it would feel really different to see this asymmetrical weirdness, or it makes it feel a lot more organic. I think we touched on that a bit earlier, but we just kind of, we have an aesthetic, we have a definite style, and you can tell that we have a style as level designers versus when you look at some of the levels that other people have made. It's fairly distinct, but...
Someone did like a portrait of Einstein.
Yeah. It's
really good too. It's like you know exactly who it is, but just out of tiles and...
People have done amazing things.
Someone made a calculator like that works.
Like a working, in the game.
We just found that like a week
There's
ago.
a blog post. I posted it today. You should check it out. But yeah, we just kind of, like, that's kind of the fun of it. You just kind of play around and see what works, and you can change it minutely and go back and you like test it again, make a tiny change, test it again. It is amazing to see how that one tiny change can make a level feel completely different. So, yeah. Did you have anything to add to that?
What was the original question?
It was just about the where the motifs in the games come
Oh yeah. No, we've done everything. Like there are some levels that are like, if you look at an aerial photograph of the building that's directly south of this one, it's literally, we made a level out of it, because I used to work in Metro Hall, so at lunch I'd be walking around and I'd be like, oh yeah, that's a cool shape. Or like Mare's used blueprints for some, just like, because the thing is, it's sort of like, N is so freeform, you really just need any, you can start anywhere, and then once you play it, then you immediately see, oh, in this corner, I can do these sort of things. And so it's like, it's really more, it's like an ink blot test where it's just like, it can be anything, and then stuff condenses, like the possibilities condense as soon as you try it, and then you start playing with that.
Okay, wait, the ink blot mention reminded me of something that I kind of wanted to talk about, but forgot until we were looking at some of the levels, which is the accidental swastika.
Oh yeah,
That's
look
something
out.
that happens
That's one of the
all
level
time.
design hazards for sure.
Yeah.
It happens all the time.
Oh, I jumped at that. But yes, no, I've done, yeah. Yeah, you're just kind of like, oh,
So easy.
this room has got a chest and this room's got, oh, no.
Yeah, especially if you like geometric stuff and patterns, like it really comes up, and then you're like, oh, but it looks so good, but you have to kind of change it. So yeah, that and like penis shapes are often hard to avoid. So.
Wait, you're supposed to avoid those?
Really?
Really?
Actually, there are swastikas all over Japan, but they're mirrored. They bend the other way because it's like a sacred shrine symbol. So it's,
Might have been that.
I don't know which way it is. We stay away from those two because just culturally, no one really notices. They're just gonna see a swastika. I mean, Doom had one too, but they changed it.
Sweet.
Anything on the swastika.
That's great.
Oh yes, swastikalish. That's a level name we'll never use, but you all get to know about it.
That's right. Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So yeah, thanks for coming out, everybody. Thanks to all our speakers. I thought those talks were really, really great. Again, please fill out your surveys and give them to me or Alex Hader. And I really want, this is just my plea, I really want more design talks at the ITPA like this. So if you want that, please write that on your survey. Please, just everyone write it, even if you don't want it. Just do it for me. And we are heading over to the office pub for our final social of the year, I think. Also, it's just straight up John Street. It might be karaoke night there, so that could happen. That's a fun Friday thing that we're gonna party out to. Sorry. Yeah. Have a good night, everyone.